So this video is not going to be typical of what I post on this channel, but I was thinking it over and I don't even have a large enough audience to start caring if every one of my videos falls under the same niche. This is still a commentary video if that counts for anything, and maybe you'll learn something new if you aren't part of the keyboard community and stick around. So as the thumbnail and title indicate, I'm going to be talking about keyboards, specifically custom mechanical ones, as that's where my interest and experience lie in. I don't have anyone in my life who shares this hobby with me, nor have I had any conversations over the internet, so I was thinking, why don't I just post this video? Just as some clarification, this isn't going to be a deep dive into mechanical keyboards, and it's not going to be a guide to those trying to get into the hobby, though there will be a mention of some technical stuff. So why did I pick keyboards? I know on the internet you could be involved in the most niche, unrecognized hobby and still find a community around that interest. But for me, this didn't arise out of a shared passion for keyboards, though I have watched a lot of mechanical keyboard content on YouTube, and it was what introduced me to the hobby. But to simply put, my reason for joining the mechanical keyboard community is that I spend the majority of my day at the computer, so I'm going to care about things that make that experience more enjoyable and comfortable. And the most direct, tangible way to improve that experience is in regards to your computer peripherals. And what I've identified to be the three peripherals that you can make a hobby out of, they would be your mouse, keyboard, and audio devices, because you have the most variety and choice when it comes to these. My view on why I've chosen keyboards as my primary interest is that I see it as a happy medium of the three hobbies. On one hand, mice are relatively simple devices, and the way I see it, a lot of the choices boil down to whether you want a mouse for office use or gaming, and that's going to dictate things like your choices on weight, shape, how responsive the switches and sensor are, etc. Another thing is that these products are meant to be used out of the box, so you can't change things like the visual design, the mouse switches, or the weight without significant effort. On the other hand, audio devices are way too complex. Maybe I'm just too stupid, but I feel like you have to be insanely autistic to be an audiophile. Because it's not just about the device you're using to listen to stuff, so that'd be your headphones, IEMs, or speakers, but then you have equally complex devices and software to help modify and measure your listening experience through DACs, preamps, amps, audio interfaces, and so on. I remember trying to get into the audio community, but everything was just too hard to follow. I'd be shown a bunch of graphs when all I really care about is the comfort and functionality of the product. Because to my understanding, the main form of modification is through EQ or changing the materials, like ear tips or headphone pads, to emphasize certain parts of the sound. I'm not really sure. This isn't a dig at audiophiles because I'm probably misrepresenting a lot about what the community is, but my issue is that it was just too difficult to get a foothold into it because a lot of the information I saw wasn't that beginner friendly. But mice and audio devices aside, we're finally back in my wheelhouse, so I can explain why keyboards as a hobby are both easy to get into and can scale well based on your level of interest. And to me, the main draw is the modularity of the product because there are so many ways you can customize a keyboard and really make it your own. The four main ways to customize a keyboard are the switches, the keycaps, the case, and the internal components, with that last one being multi-layered. But these things also intersect a lot because they're going to affect the sound, the typing feel, and visual of the keyboard in different ways. Which is why keyboards are unique because you get the most choice in changing the aesthetic. I know that sounds like a superficial reason to enjoy them, like big deal, you can change how they look, but I feel like you'd understand if you're someone who puts a lot of time and effort into your desktop setup. Because to go back to my criticisms of the earlier two, mice are becoming increasingly more functional. For example, mice don't come with RGB anymore, the design isn't visual but more practical for optimal weight and comfort. And for audio devices, I don't see why you'd care how a pair of headphones or IEMs look when you can't even see them. When taking that into context, I feel like it's pretty easy to understand why you'd want a good looking keyboard that sounds and feels nice to type on. And to make these modifications, you don't have to start dissecting the nuances of switch force curve graphs or the type of dampening material to find something that generally fits your preferences. However, if you do want to fine tune the sound profile and typing feel exactly, it's not too complicated because of how accessible modifying a keyboard is. To clarify, I'm talking about custom keyboard kits because if you're trying to take apart a pre-built mechanical keyboard from 2013 and aims to modify it, it's going to be quite the challenge. Also, the level of customizability is why I gravitated towards mechanical keyboards. I don't think their sound or feel is anything superior to things like ALP switches or electrocapacitive because it's just preferential. It's just that the current market has favored the MX switch design in custom keyboards more than any other switch type. So yeah, I think that's generally why I've stuck around with mechanical keyboards, is because they're the only peripheral that really satisfies the desire of complete customizability and it wasn't that hard to start learning the specifics of the hobby. Now I want to get into my journey with both mechanical keyboards broadly, and then how I progressed into custom keyboards. The first mechanical keyboard I ever had was a Corsair K70, and it's nearly impossible to remember the exact model because Corsair keeps re-releasing it under the exact same name. But mine was the full-size version and came with Cherry MX Browns. It had this thick braided non-detachable cable that ended with two separate USB-A receivers and had these thin shine-through ABS keycaps. I got this back in late 2017 when I had built my first PC, and it was my daily driver for nearly 3 years. That was until I broke the spacebar switch. I was playing Type Racer, and in my adolescent rage, I slammed my hand on my keyboard like I've done 1,000 times over, but I guess my keyboard had finally taken enough of the abuse. So the spacebar switch just stopped working, essentially rendering my keyboard unusable, and I had to borrow one of my younger brother's keyboards for the next few months. But my 17th birthday was coming up in 2020, and I'd actually put the time in to do some research and didn't want a generic RGB gaming keyboard, so I ended up getting a Varmillo VA87M with Cherry MX silver switches. Well, actually, the specific reason I got this keyboard was because I had gotten into Osu the previous year, and my favorite top player at the time was Flying Tuna, and this was one of the keyboards he was using, so I just thought it looked really cool and thought it would make me better at Osu. But also, if you wanted to get a premium pre-built mechanical keyboard that wasn't some overpriced Razer or Logitech trash, you'd get something from one of three brands, Leopold, Varmillo, or Philco, because these companies were way ahead of the curve compared to anything in the US when it came to build quality and typing experience. So I'd used my new Varmillo keyboard for nearly a year when pretty much the same thing happened, where I was playing Type Racer and I kept getting frustrated, so I hit my keyboard and I broke one of the stabilizer stems on the spacebar, meaning that even though the switch still worked, I couldn't press the left side of my spacebar without it wobbling so much that it wouldn't actuate the switch. And because the keyboard wasn't hot swappable, I couldn't just take out the spacebar switch to replace the stabilizers with new ones. I think I just used the keyboard as it was or went back to using one of my brother's older ones until for my 18th birthday I got my last major pre-built keyboard. So unlike my previous purchase with the Varmillo, I didn't put much thought into the aesthetic or the typing experience. I just wanted a cool Osu keyboard because I thought it'd make me a better gamer. So I'd gotten the HyperX Alloy Origins, which was the most well-known keyboard that top players used at the time. And I know what I'm about to say is going to sound terribly elitist, but my experience with the HyperX keyboard was so awful, it was one of the catalyst events that drew me to custom keyboards. In terms of gaming, it checked all the boxes. It had fast linear switches, perky RGB, and shine-through keycaps. But the typing experience was one of the worst I've ever had in any keyboard, probably tied with my original K70. It had rattly dry stabilizers, the switches were very pingy, and the keycaps were thin ABS that easily caught grease and sweat from your hands. For most people who haven't replaced their keyboard in years, it sounds like I'm making a big deal out of nothing, but just trust me on this because pre-built keyboards have improved so much in terms of typing feel and sound that you'd find your current keyboard unusable if you were to switch back to it. Honestly, I wouldn't have even noticed it was a bad experience if it wasn't for the fact that the Varmillo was such a premium product in comparison. Later that year in the summer, I realized I'd come to see keyboards as more than just a functional tool, and I had watched some videos on custom keyboards, but it still felt too much of a commitment in terms of money and time. So instead, I ordered a bunch of different keyboards in search for something that was on par with the VA87M in terms of aesthetic and typing feel. But nothing really came close, and I remember I'd ordered a dozen or more keycap sets to swap out the stock ones, and it was just an enjoyable experience because changing keycaps, it's the easiest modification you can make to a keyboard that changes the visual and typing experience of it. Also, at the time, hot swap keyboards weren't as popularized on mainstream e-commerce platforms like Amazon, so this was the best thing I could do in terms of personalizing my keyboards. Eventually, I realized making these surface level changes to them wasn't satisfying because most pre-built keyboards back then came with unlubed cherry switches, mediocre stabilizers, steel plates, and a generic or boring keycap set. I finally decided to fully commit to the custom keyboard hobby and returned most of the keyboards and keycaps I had purchased during that time and went to work on my first custom build. I had decided on the KBD 75 V3.1 by KBD fans because it had all the premium features of a custom kit. It came with different plate options, a top mount style, south-facing LEDs for cherry keycap compatibility along with a foam kit. Another important factor was that it wasn't on a group buy but a limited in-stock drop, so I only had to wait a month or two before it shipped out to me. And for my first custom build, I think I went all out. I'd used lubed and filmed Duroc T1 switches, I'd wholly modded the stabilizers, and got a matching keycap set from Acco, which used to make this profile called ASA. It's shown on a few of my boards in the thumbnail. I realized that if you aren't too deep into custom keyboards, none of what I just said makes any sense, but essentially I put a bunch of effort into making this keyboard, and what I noticed is that I really enjoyed the building experience and testing out different modifications. So much so that I bought another keyboard kit and another one, and going on over 4 years later, the rest is history. I won't go into the details of the 30 or so other keyboards I built and modified, because that would make this video even more boring than it is. But now I want to move towards present day with where I'm at with the hobby, because I do acknowledge that I don't feel the same amount of passion towards custom keyboards as I used to. And it goes back to what I said with modifying keyboards being the most satisfying thing over actually using the end product, because over time the gap between pre-built keyboards and custom ones have closed significantly when companies realized that there was a strong demand for this type of keyboard that could replicate the sound of a custom one. So companies essentially started copying over aspects of custom keyboards, but to a less personalized degree. Things like including foam, pre-lubing switches, tuning stabilizers, etc. Even though I haven't had anything in my definition that I consider endgame worthy of a custom keyboard, I can reasonably say that you can go out and purchase a pre-built mechanical keyboard and it'll get you 90% of the way there in terms of typing feel and sound compared to a custom one. While this is good for the consumer because they're getting a better product at an affordable price, I feel like a lot of the magic behind the keyboard community is gone now because there was a whole lot more innovation and creativity around modifying existing pre-builts and customs. It sounds ironic to complain about that companies are now doing the tedious work instead of consumers and making a quality product, but for me, mechanical keyboards were never just about the pure consumerism of purchasing the latest product, but taking the time to disassemble and modify the keyboard to transform it into something that uniquely reflects your preferences. Although it's overall good that I've moderated my spending habits and only have a few keyboard kits that remain unbuilt, I am a bit sad that I can't fully replicate the same joy I had when modifying older keyboards. I just hope I'm not too set in my ways and I don't become too avoidant of other hobbies, because it has been difficult to pick up new interests and stick with them since my late teens really. I believe that custom keyboards arrived at just the right time for me to become as passionate as I was about them, and I'll always be grateful for the experiences I've had with them. And as a closing note, if someone were to ask me if they should get into custom keyboards today, to give you the short answer, I would just say no. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a cool hobby, but with the current state of the keyboard community, and more broadly the economy, it's much more worthwhile to just get a pre-built and call it a day. If you really are curious, then I guess getting a single keyboard kit, some pre-loop switches, and budget keycaps wouldn't hurt. I mean, if any of you guys are in need of recommendations, I'd be honored if you were to take my opinion on the matter. But aside from that, I can't really think of anything else on the subject, so that might be it for the video. Next thing I'll make will be more abstract of a topic and more in line with what I normally discuss on this channel. So until then, goodbye.